The contents of today's lecture is going to focus on two chapters of Eric Holt Gimenez, A Foodie's Guide to Capitalism. And what we're going to be looking at today specifically is food and agriculture. And we're also going to look at food, gender, class, and race as well. So a lot of this has to do with the development of our agricultural system, as well as how different social relations have become part of that also, and have developed along with our capitalist food system. And then the conclusion of this is to figure out then how to transition our food system into something that is better. As you will notice from chapter 5, especially of Eric Holt Gimenez, the idea here is that if we want to transition our food system into something better, we have to address issues with capitalism, with colonialism, with race relations, with class and gender relations. But at the same time is that these relations developed along with our capitalist food system, and these things are part and parcel of the capitalist food system. So, you know, within addressing food and capitalism and all of these things is that they intersect into a way that we need to then figure out what to do with all of these different issues that have come out, and hopefully devise a better food system, but in the same time, you know, devise more equal relations amongst people, as well as, you know, develop ways to feed masses, not necessarily bundled with all these structural inequalities. So one thing to keep in mind is that if we're going to look at building food justice, this goes hand in hand with building social justice. So we cannot create a just food system unless we have conditions of social justice. You know, if people are in structural inequality situations, then they're not going to be equal also in the context of food. So, you know, just building food justice in and of itself doesn't accomplish anything. We have to link this into larger social issues and actually deal with those at the same time. So, one of the starting points is actually looking at how capitalist agriculture has formed and the different contradictions within it. So in capitalism, you know, capitalists, people with money or capital, invest into different companies. Basically, they throw capital into circulation and basically invest into the means of production, and they invest into labor forces in order to then go and make surplus on that. Basically, surplus is any kind of time over and above what the labor needs to reproduce themselves. And this goes to usually the capitalists in a capitalist situation, because basically they're extracting the surplus off of the laborers. Now, there are major contradictions in this within the capitalist system, is because workforces or farms are not necessarily lucrative when it comes to capital investments. And this is because of some glaring contradictions. So in order to profit off of labor forces, what needs to be done is we need to increase efficiencies, basically relative surplus. So we need to make sure that the laborers are able to do things at a lot more efficient rates, or basically looking at absolute surplus is actually increasing the amount of laborers put into circulation, or the you know, the context of increasing labor time, so making people work for longer hours during the day. Now, during especially the beginning of capitalism, there's been a lot of pushback from the laborers in order to make sure that they're not being exploited in the way of the amount of labor hours that they're giving in a day. So at the beginning of capitalism, you know, it was common for people to work 18-hour days. And then, you know, eventually through different struggles and pushback on capitalists, you know, the working day was reduced to 16 hours and reduced to 10 hours and reduced to, right now we have about 8 hours of labor force during the day. So it's very hard for capitalists to go back on that now and actually increase the working day. Although, you know, the argument is there in the United States, some people are actually working more than one job. So, you know, they are put into a situation where they actually need to increase the working day in order to make their ends meet. But basically, capitalists are always trying to increase the surplus of relative surplus. So they're always trying to increase efficiencies in food production. The issue, though, within that is that it's very time consuming to produce food in agriculture. especially if we're going to do it to minimize externalities or environmental externalities, or basically any kind of negative context that comes from agriculture. So if we want to produce food from a way of agroecology, which is actually taking elements of nature and trying to reproduce these elements, trying to actually use more natural ways of producing food rather than putting synthetic chemicals and fertilizers, well, that takes time. It actually takes time to build soils. It also takes time to grow plants as well. So, like any other labor force, usually the production that's going into it is actually going to reflect the outcomes. The more people that you have working on assembly lines, the more products that you'll have out there, which could be the case for agriculture, but then there's a time delay, because in order to produce plants, the plants have to grow, they have to fruit or come into fruition, and then afterwards they could be harvested. But there's a delay between the inputs of a laborer and what plants need to do. So there's quite a few contradictions when it comes to profitability in capitalist agriculture, as well as some structural issues also, because within capitalism, people are expected to reproduce themselves also to some degree that coming from outside of the capitalist context. So people need to reproduce themselves at home, they need to cook food, and they need to do other things, which is not compensated. And one of the criticisms is that this has fallen quite heavily on females in order to reproduce the household. Even to today, where we think things are more equal, there's a lot of studies to show that the brunt of the responsibility still falls on females as opposed to males. So there's a lot of contradictions coming into this. People need to reproduce themselves. Capitalism relies on things that are outside of capital in order to reproduce people and laborers. And to the extent as labor is not necessarily the most lucrative form of capital production when it comes to food. So there's glaring contradictions in trying to make profitability from agriculture as a capitalist. So what is usually seen right now in the ways of profitability is the companies that are making inputs like machinery, like selling seeds and selling fertilizers, are some of the most lucrative companies. I showed you some of them last time, like Dow Chemical, Syngenta, China Chem, Bayer, all of these big companies that are actually merging together are in the way of making inputs rather than growing food themselves. So they basically supply the fertilizers, they supply the seeds and the machineries and different things like that. As well as, in capitalism and agriculture, we've been taught or are teaching people through agricultural schools that the best way to grow food is through these mechanisms like introduced during the Green Revolution. So that we need to mechanize, and we need to have higher input seeds, and we need to have higher yielding seeds, and we need all of these things in agriculture, which is not true. Food could grow in soil that's been taken care of very well, a lot better than soil that's actually been going through chemical fertilizing processes and other things like that. So we're thinking of agriculture as a very high input, high mechanized trade, because what capitalists are trying to do is they're trying to extract as much of efficiencies from the labor as possible. And actually, as we see, is that it's not as profitable as could be, and is not necessarily a very profitable industry. It's actually subsidized quite a bit by the governments. And actually, as I showed you from Darren Quailman's article, is that farmers, especially in Canada, are taking out very large loans in order to make sure that their agricultural needs are met. And most times, actually, it leads them to bankruptcy because they're not able to pay back their loans based on these promises of high yield seeds and fertilizers and all of these things from these large companies. So, there's kind of an impetus for people to think that we need to feed the world through these large farms that are highly mechanized and have these GMO seeds and are quite specialized in that. But what we realize is actually the bulk of farming comes from peasantry. So there are people across the world, actually about 70% of the farms that go to feed the world are from peasant farms, from people that are producing agriculture in small scales within their community and providing food throughout their community. So what Eric Holt-Gimenez calls the persistence of peasantry, although we have developed this large-scale agricultural system, it is not the majority of how farm products are produced. The majority of them are still in peasant farms. So there are other glaring contradictions also in capitalist food systems, is that one of them is all this discussion about production. So farms are trying to overproduce a lot of food. And when they do so, what they're doing is they're driving down the prices. So if you think about the laws of supply and demand, the more supply that you have, the cheaper the prices are. So what farmers then go about doing is they restrict their food and try to give it at off times in order to increase the price that they could sell it at, or find other or other consumer markets throughout the world that will actually purchase things at higher rates. So Canada is actually one of the largest exporters of agriculture of the world. I think they're about fourth or so. I haven't checked recently, but they were around fourth, about a year ago. So Canada is a very large agricultural exporter. We heavily subsidize our agriculture, and in order for that to happen, companies are looking for markets throughout the world that they could sell things at subsidized rates from our Canadian government and basically sell them for as much as they can in other places. So by overproducing, we're driving down prices. And then when we drive down prices, it makes farming not necessarily a viable business. So there's all these contradictions that come into play when we look at the business of agriculture and profitability and all of these things that are bundled with capitalism. Another contradiction is about agricultural labor time. So prices of food have been kept artificially low. And as we're going to look at in the next chapter, one of the reasons is the beginning of capitalism in so-called North America began with the introduction of slavery. So people from Africa were brought over on boats and put into conditions of slavery, working on plantations and farms and not being paid to do so, which actually kept food prices very low. And for capitalism, this was something that actually kept labor prices really low also. Because one of the things, in order to reproduce your workforce, you need people to reproduce themselves, and they need to reproduce themselves within a social context, within their communities. So, to reproduce a labor, a large part of that cost goes to the reproduction of themselves through food. And if you keep food prices really low, then the reproduction of a laborer becomes really low also. Now, within that, we also need to be reproduced socially as well. And there's large arguments and contradictions within just, this idea of reproduction is, what do we actually need to do to reproduce ourselves? In a capitalist economy, if people are not necessarily spending into the economy, then the system doesn't really function. So over and above food costs, people need to reproduce themselves socially, and they need to participate by purchasing things that are being produced within the capitalist industry. So, to keep labor costs low, capitalists have relied on slave labor in order to reproduce the food. And actually, this is quite a contradiction, because a lot of people, when they think about capitalism, they think about actually kind of emancipating slaves or, freeing slave-like conditions in order to have people participate as workers and laborers. But what we see, especially in food, is that the glaring contradictions is slavery was used in order to produce food and still exists today as a form of modern slavery, where people are producing food in Canada even, over the summer this year, and in other locations as well, but basically are being imported as migrant laborers, are not given the same rights as other people in Canada. Actually, if you're following the news, a lot of the migrant laborers were not allowed to leave their housing complexes. Basically, they reside in very small quarters in the farms, and a lot of these laborers were told that they couldn't go out into the world to do what they wanted to do on their own time, because the farmers were concerned about them catching COVID or other things. And actually, ironically, a lot of the provisions that were given to these farmers are actually very minuscule when it comes to food rations or other things as well. The people that are producing our food presently in Canada, that are brought in from other countries, from the global south, are put into conditions where they're not even able to meet their dietary needs, and they're the ones producing our food. So there's so many different contradictions that exist. The way that the capitalist food industry started began, in the context of structural racism, and this has not gone away and still exists today. And the other thing that I've discussed in other courses or other classes from this class before is that we still also try to drive down the cost of food by importing things from places where we're not necessarily paying people subsistence wages, and we're trying to drive down the cost of food continuously by purchasing things from places in the world where labor is very cheap. So the idea of capitalism in agriculture is that capitalists are trying to extract as much surplus as possible, but there's limitations to this, and it's not necessarily the best when it comes to investments. So there was two kind of discussions in Eric Holt Gimenez's book where they talk about appropriationism and basically talking about how do we make the workforce more efficient in different streams, and how do we actually capitalize by increasing relative surplus. And one of them looks at basically kind of replacing workers with machinery and other ways of getting more high yielding crops. So putting in, these technologies in order to make crops grow faster. So basically what they call upstream appropriationism. And what this did is led to an imploding of the farms in the way of labor force. So basically we don't really rely on as many agricultural laborers as before because we're trying to replace them with machinery, as well as when it comes to farms, there's issues with their viability. So a lot of farms implode on themselves and have been gobbled up by very, very large agricultural producers. And what they call substitutionism is more of the downstream mechanism, is instead of having producers and consumers come together and discuss products and actually have a direct relationship with each other, we have this whole array of processing and distribution companies and kind of explode into a whole array of transforming and distributing companies. So let's just say farmers producing carrots. Other companies may purchase carrots and transform that into different products that they have. Might not be sold as a carrot, but maybe some kind of processed food that contains certain ingredients kind of pulled from all these different farms. And, as well as a lot of people are buying their food from large grocery stores where you don't actually have a relationship with the direct distributor anymore, but basically it's being sold to you by a large company who purchase off distributors and make the food available at the grocery stores. So these two mechanisms are actually trying to extract as much of the surplus as possible from the labor context. And these are ways to make money out of food, rather than relying on the traditional farming. They also, or Eric Holt Gimenez also discusses investments and how it's not necessarily the most lucrative form to invest into farms and to become, a farming industry. But there are other ways to make money off investments. So, sometimes people invest into the futures and look at a commodity, food commodities as stocks. So they'll invest into whatever the future of this commodity is, and when the investment comes to maturity and the farmer goes to sell their produce, they'll make money or lose money depending on what the investment was at the time and whatever the return is on this investment. So, food is put into the stock market, and a lot of the investments, people might gain and lose money on their stocks, but for the farmers, they gain and lose their livelihoods depending on how well their production goes. So there's a lot more strain on farmers when it comes to the investment because their farming livelihood depends on their ability to sell food, for a certain expected costs in order to reproduce themselves in the farms. Okay, so the other aspect that's being discussed in agricultural labor is that there's different ways that these contracts can come about. So a lot of companies are trying to expand into vertical integration and trying to expand their reach in farms and their influence over how the farms function by signing these market specification contracts. So contract to a farmer to say, you're going to produce this much tomatoes, or you're going to produce this much of a specific ingredient. So basically they'll sign a specific contract with this farmer and expect whatever the productive returns are. So you have very large companies that are not necessarily invested into farming as farmers, but actually are investing into these contracts with farmers in order to guarantee that they're going to get some kind of return when it comes to food. The resource providing contracts is sometimes the companies actually provide the external inputs, so provide the chemicals, fertilizers, or have a very specific mechanism as to how they want their food to be grown. But if we look at these farming contracts, well, much of the risk goes on the farmer, okay? So the farmer has to reproduce their farms and their livelihoods, and when these farming contracts are offered, if the yield doesn't necessarily turn out to what the farmer wanted to, they could have obligations within their contract that, the contract doesn't have to be met in specific conditions if their agricultural produce don't meet the specifications. But at the same time, too, if their yields are not very strong, or if there are certain things that happen to their crops, this could actually jeopardize their livelihood for futures. So these people that sign these market specification contracts only have a vested interest for the season. So, they're looking out for their investment and making sure that whatever they've invested into comes into fruition. But for a farmer, this could make or break their business itself and make them, viable or not in the long and short term. They also talk about a rational agriculture. So a major glaring contradiction in capitalist agriculture is, in order to be more of a farm that is sustainable, and sustainability, what I'm talking about, in this context, is environmental sustainability. So if we want to reproduce our farms in ways that are not harmful for the soil, for the land, for the water, we need to actually do this in a slow process. So basically what they're calling rational agriculture. In order to do that, what we need to do is invest time into making sure that the soil is arable. So this could take years to do, and actually, has a very slow process if you're going to maintain this. So, ways that are discussed is agroecology, where actually we're using a scientific method to look at kind of traditional farming techniques and use these techniques in order to grow agriculture in ways that are better for the environment. So looking at crop rotations, looking at companion planting, not having monoculture farms where we produce one of the same crop or, a couple of the same crop, but actually looking at diversification, looking at actually rotating between animals and crops, and having cover crops also. So things that actually will keep carbons in the soil, things that animals could graze on, and then basically, through their poop and their excrement and them walking on the different land will make the soil more arable. And then in the future, when you do crop rotations, you could actually bring in and plant crops where you had animals who are pooping on the land and walking all over the land. Now, in order to do that, it takes a lot of time, though. Okay? It's not something that just happens through a machine or through technology. It's something that farmers need to do to invest in and actually work and kind of be symbiotic with the relation with the land that they're working with. So it's not something that you could just speed up a process and then extract as much surplus as possible. But it's something that's a slow process and actually costs the farmer quite a bit in the way of time. There are ways to do this and actually still have very high yielding farms and crops. But for a lot of these agricultural laborers, especially people that are looking at subsistence farms or peasant farms, the goal isn't always to produce as much as possible, but to actually live in a context that you don't need to always put external inputs into your land. You could actually work the soil, and through the mechanisms of your farming, that the soil will actually be replenished, and you're going to keep the nutrients into your soil. This requires a lot more production time. The other argument is that we need to move towards a moral economy. So capitalism, the values that are being produced are monetary values. We look at commodification systems as this kind of relationship of value, where what we're trying to do is accrue more surplus, and these are the values that are promoted in capitalist systems. But other moral values are quite important also. How do we have a democratic system? How do we involve people into their food systems or even into their economy in ways that actually don't jeopardize their health or their livelihoods or the health and livelihood of the planet for future generations? So there's a very strong argument that we actually need to shift values away from just the self-reproduction and social reproduction through capitalism, but actually look at more of a moral economy, and how do we expand reciprocity circles, or how do we expand the moral economy? Quebec has very good examples of how we've done that, or how we have done that, what they call the social economy of Quebec. So basically, Quebec has a lot more investment into cooperatives and nonprofits and other things. That these companies actually have moral standards over and above profit making. So it's not that they're averse to making any kind of surplus, but basically the aspects of their business supersede making surplus, and actually they're still viable. So there's many different examples that I could go over if you have questions about that. They also talk about different farming styles. So capitalist farming style basically is to extract as much as possible when it comes to capital surplus, to try to intensify the products that are coming out, and basically to not have people invest as much labor, or basically to be able to extract as much of the surplus from their labor as possible. But there's other farming styles that have been mentioned also. So entrepreneurial partners, as well as, people sometimes want to make a business and have a small farm. And you'll notice actually in Quebec, there are a lot of people that are trying to do that now, people that have either graduated from McGill Agricultural School or other people that are investing into farming. Some of them are urban agriculture, people that are investing into urban agriculture, but other people are going towards the suburbs or other places as well. But there's kind of a renewed interest in getting farming going from an entrepreneurial context. So somebody that actually has done that and published on this is somebody named Curtis Stone, who is basically a market farmer in British Columbia, and has written a book about how to make money as an entrepreneurial farmer by actually using people's backyards in the city and other ways of obtaining land, and basically sharing some of the surplus with the people that are donating their land to him. But basically, has made a business, and quite a lucrative business, off of farming, off of land that has been acquired or donated to him from other people, and basically doing CSA baskets all over different parts of where his local neighborhood is. And there are people in Quebec that are doing similar endeavors also. So it is a way that some entrepreneurs get some money, but in the bigger process is farming requires labor, and this is in direct competition and contradiction with capitalism. Is that you can't reduce labor time in order to extract too much away from it without compromising your soil, and without compromising the environment or social factors. So the other glaring contradiction here is that there's quite a few peasant farms that still exist throughout the world, to the extent that we feed the world through peasant farms. This hasn't gone away. So a lot of people are making their own self-reproduction at home through peasant farms, but also sell some of the surplus in order to then make ends meet in other ways as well. There are different ways that farming still exists in capitalism, but some of them still are in contradiction to that, like peasant farming, where people still maintain themselves and their livelihoods by reproducing themselves and their food. Another major topic in Eric Holt-Gimenez's chapter is actually about the metabolic rift. So what we've done is we've separated ourselves from our livelihoods. Basically, we've separated ourselves from reproducing ourselves. There was a major push to get people away from common lands and countrysides and actually go towards the cities. So in other lectures, I discussed the enclosures. So, at the beginning of capitalism in Europe, there was these enclosures that were developed that were allocated to farmers in order to produce agriculture in ways of capitalism. And a lot of people were pushed off of these common lands when they were enclosed, and actually because they couldn't meet or reproduce their livelihoods, had to flee to cities, and actually then had to rely on capitalism to reproduce themselves. So, what happens in early agriculture is actually we still were more connected than we are today. And now we've kind of made rifts between our self-reproduction, the reproduction of animals, and basically the reproduction and the health of our soils. So before, we were kind of the primary producers, as we could see in the diagram here in early agriculture. We ate some of the plants that were produced in farms or available in fields, or, basically if we're talking about early agriculture, we're talking about people actually cultivating the land and actually then feeding people right from the cultivation. But at the same time, animals ate from the cover crops and from the fields themselves and actually were integrated into the process. So they're producing nutrients for the soils. As well as, by using plants ourselves, we then go about composting and putting the nutrients back into the soil. So, here we have more of a connected view of farming, where it's not just about extraction, but also about replenishing. We're replenishing the nutrients. We're using the animals in order to actually help with the process, because they also help reproduce the nutrients that are needed in farms. So, in the early urbanization society, what is described is actually we're disconnecting ourselves from our food process. We're disconnecting ourselves from raising animals and incorporating animals into farms, as well as separating ourselves from the products of labor, basically the food products that we need to eat. So we see ourselves as separated from these things. And actually, I would say even to today, a lot of people probably understand the degrees of separation, because you go into a grocery store and you don't know where a lot of this food comes from. For a lot of people, it's really easy to buy a steak, but it's very hard to go and kill an animal in order to be able to get your steak. So a lot of people disconnected themselves from the process and don't really know what goes into making the foods that they're actually they're consuming from the grocery store. But then I guess the late agricultures, we've actually separated animals from this process too. So no longer do the animals go and graze on open fields, but actually are part of this kind of industrial process of factory farms, where we produce plants like soya and other kind of grains in order to feed the animals. So they're the primary consumers of the products, the food products that we're producing. And then basically the animals go to feed humans, as well as kind of this secondary process is the plants that we're producing are also disconnected from our understanding and are disconnected from us having any kind of input towards it, because we're just getting them off of farmers who've turned food products into commodities and transformed them in certain ways. And these are the products that we're consuming. And also we've disconnected animals from the process also. So what used to be quite integrated as a farming technique has actually been quite separated. We're separating ourselves from our understanding of where food comes from, and even separating it from the idea of food. When we go to the grocery store and we buy like a fruit roll-up, or we buy like cereals or other things like that, these foods are quite heavily processed, and a lot of time don't even resemble what we consider real food. They're not like fruits and vegetables anymore, but they're highly processed, integrated with sugar and salts and fats and other things like that. And these are the kind of the food products or the food commodities that we're getting. So by separating all of these things, we're not replenishing the soils and we're not incorporating back the nutrients, but we're always in the process of extracting. And this is heavily taxing to the environments that we're working on. And we're seeing major effects of this presently. Actually, this is one of the hottest years. I think it is the hottest year that's ever been recorded. And we're still producing a lot of greenhouse gases, actually more than we ever have before. And the culprit is our farming techniques. We are not looking out for our soil, and we're not integrating a holistic approach into farming. We're trying to think of ourselves as separated from this whole process. In doing so, we're destroying a lot of the environment, and we're producing a lot of externalities that are quite harmful for people and the planet. So alongside food and capitalism is a whole bunch of structural injustices. You probably heard about structural racism presently, because there's a large discussion happening in the United States about structural racism. So what do we mean by structural racism? Well, one way to think about this, and actually this is going back to a chart that I showed you from Urie Bronfenbrenner, and I know this doesn't necessarily discuss racism per se, but it's a good way to think about how the microsystem or individuals actually operate within a macro system, okay? And this is a good way to understand structural racism and structural inequalities. So, outside of us, there is a whole social system at play. So there's different laws and rules and customs and all of these things that have been developed throughout time and actually have been part and parcel to develop along with capitalism, okay? So in order for capitalism to have survived and to be as prevalent throughout the world, is that capitalism was linked with colonialism and expansionism. So capitalists from Europe have actually expanded to different places all over the world. One being North America, or so-called North America. So by doing so, we've actually infringed on the customs and the traditions of the people that resided here before. So the indigenous populations, had to or were forced to conform to broad ideological laws and customs that were actually brought over from Europe. A lot of these customs went right against the kind of traditional knowledge of the indigenous people in Canada and the United States. Now, why is this important is actually, if we look at how structures work, is that there are these huge overarching traditions and customs and laws that have been developed. Some of them, predate us and have been around for hundreds of years. Now, one of them being, actually, especially in the development of capitalism, is this idea of property, which we discussed last class. So property is one of the foundational things that help capitalism survive. And one way that property has been instated is actually it has been built into our law system. So in the United States Constitution, people have the right to have property, as well as, in Canada, that's built into our law system also. Now, why is this important, actually? Because if you actually look at the context of slavery, when people were brought from Africa into North America, they were considered property. And actually the police forces around those times were actually enforcing or maintaining and upholding people as property. So, a lot of the structures that were developed in the 1800s in North America and even brought over from Europe protected the laws and customs in order to keep property and to maintain capitalism. And a lot of these infringed on people's basic rights as people because they weren't thought of as people, they were thought of as property. So a lot of these law systems and institutions still exist today. So, in order to address these major concerns, we need to look at broad perspectives and not just think of racism, sexism, and all of these things as just kind of daily interpersonal things, okay? It's not just rooted in the individual, but it's rooted in the context, the broad ideologies and customs that have been developed over hundreds of years. So what does that mean altogether? Well, it means that the discussion cannot just root on, well, I'm not racist or I'm not sexist, therefore it doesn't exist, or that we've changed a lot over the context of a couple hundred years and it doesn't exist anymore. Well, it really does, okay? And for a lot of people, these are daily situations that are, that are felt and experienced by certain groups of people. And as we could see in the United States and in Canada, a lot of people are pushing back on these bigger structures and basically saying that no, we are not going to tolerate this anymore and we're going to have to do something about it. So what do I mean altogether? Well, right before COVID became a big situation in Canada and the United States, well, we had the wet sweating population that were actually trying to protect their customary land, unceded territory from the development of pipelines. We have the governments in BC and Alberta trying to build pipelines through unceded territory, and these people were actually trying to defend this territory. And a lot of the context that was being described as, well, we need to export oil, we need to extract oil, this is part of the capitalist mode, and it provides resources for people, it also provides taxes dollars and provides employment. But this is really rooted in something that is racist, because these people depend on their land in order for survival, and this is unceded territory. So these contexts haven't gone away yet. They are still prevalent in Canada and the United States, although some people like to deny this. Our society was founded on structural inequalities, and we need to rectify these things. So, looking at food and changing our food system, it's not just about buying organic or, reducing meat, but it's actually about confronting these structural inequalities and actually changing them so that they don't exist anymore. And I know a lot of people have issues with that because of, when people have privilege within in the society, and in order to give people justices, it means actually giving away certain privileges, or basically allowing people to have the same privileges. And for a lot of people, they've taken concern with this. But these are things that need to be addressed. If we're actually going to say that we're going to have a just food system, we need to actually configure a just society also. And that means dealing with and discussing and actually, trying to make amends to things that are rooted in structures and institutions in the bigger picture, and not just about interpersonal relationships. All right, so another aspect is that food plays a major role into social reproduction. So if we're actually looking at patriarchal societies, well, women have assumed much of the responsibility of reproducing the household. And in doing that, the capitalist system doesn't not recognize that as legitimate forms of work. To the extent that they don't count it in the GDP, they don't factor that into overall productive aspects of society, and therefore, is diminished when it comes to our understanding about how capitalism reproduces itself. And now with that, though, these are necessary things in order to reproduce people. So we've taken it outside of the context of capitalism, but at the same time, it's necessary for capitalism to function. So there's very unequal divisions of labor that still exist today. And actually, if you look at kind of these structural components, you could see that inequality exists between men and women, but also, between different groups of people in society. You could actually look at that when it comes to the compensation that people get. So men are better compensated than women when it comes to specific jobs, and even in between jobs, they're considered, more gendered towards men and towards women. But also we see this in just the global aspect of, how people have accumulated wealth. So white males are the ones that are accumulating the most wealth of the world, and, are assuming a lot of the positions of power when it comes to politics and when it comes to, being part of or CEOs or other very powerful positions in different companies. So, these things, they're not fun to discuss, but they're things that are necessary to discuss. If we're going to revamp our food system, we actually have to come in confrontation with these injustices. We need to look at ways of making things more equalized, but at the same time, give people access to equal opportunity to participate within the economy, to be able to get different privileges and, for society to become more equal. And, that's not to say that everybody's going to be equal all the time, but we could reduce inequalities to the extent that it becomes, very insignificant or more, less meaningful than what we have right now. So here I've linked to actually an article talking about modern slavery, because a lot of people would say, well, these things don't exist anymore, but they do actually. If you look at the way that migrant laborers are being treated in Canada, they're similar conditions, that we've seen in the past. It's just a reincarnation of modern slavery. And in this article, they're actually pointing out how a lot of the migrant laborers that are working on the farms are not even allowed to leave their quarters. So, we're reincarnating very similar conditions today, and we haven't done away with some of the old structures that exist that, are still founded in racism, patriarchy, and class divisions. Okay, so other things that were brought up, I guess, especially when we're looking at unequal relations between genders, is what Eric Gimenez talks about: super exploitation of non-wage workers. A lot of the time, especially in the 1800s and even early 1900s, till today even, women assumed a lot of the responsibility of the reproduction of laborers, but we're not necessarily exploited within their labor force when it comes to extraction of capitalists of the surplus, but actually we're in a context of super exploitation because they weren't even compensated for the work that they're doing. Other discussions also are about the caste system and justifications of slavery for property, but we could actually address this in another realm also. So there was a group of biologists, one person that actually pushed this agenda was someone named Herbert Spencer. So Herbert Spencer in the 1800s discussed this idea of social Darwinism, and actually probably a lot of you have heard the term the survival of the fittest. And a lot of people will say, oh, well, that was Darwin talking about how genes influence, passing down to offspring, and the ones that actually had stronger genes were the ones that were more likely to pass down. And these are the ones that survived, and actually because of their strong genetic structures are now more prevalent and, have been able to be part of, I guess, the history of, I guess, genetics altogether. But the other context is this, okay? So some people took Darwin's theories, like Herbert Spencer, and actually then appropriated them to talk about social conditions. So what did they do is Herbert Spencer claimed the term or coined the term survival of the fittest to take Darwin's theories about genetics and then apply them to social context also. That people are born into certain conditions because of their family situation or because of their social situation. And some people are actually more superior than others. So basically taking biological determinism and then applying that to social determinism and then using these similar arguments. Now, if we look at racism, a lot of these racist arguments that have been brought forward actually stem from social Darwinism and stem from this belief that there are superior people in the world. And these people actually deserve to be where they are. And this is not something that's new. It's something that's actually been developed and discussed for quite a long time and still actually has incarnations into our society as being legitimate. So, how do we transform this whole food system and capitalism? It seems like quite a huge feat, and it really is, okay? And not that we're gonna solve all of the issues in this one class here, but these are things that we need to reflect on. And if we need, or if we want to have a just system, and if we want to provide food justice, it means that we actually have to look at the structural issues within our system as well. We need to start addressing these structural issues. So we need to address structural racism, classism, sexism, and we need to understand actually how they've been integrated into the system also. So we can't just change the food system like, just like that without addressing all of these structural issues. But we also have to understand that the food system is part and parcel of the capitalist system. So we need to transform the capitalist system at the same time. And there's an argument put forth that, if we want to transform capitalism, we actually have to transform the food system because the food system, the way we've developed it, has gone part and parcel with the way capitalism has developed also. And the two actually need to be changed together. So Eric Holt Gimenez writes this paragraph: we can't change the food system without transforming capitalism. Yet, we can't transform capitalism without changing the food system. We can't do either of these things without ending patriarchy, racism, and classism. So if we want a better food system, we have to change everything. Admittedly, this is a tall order for any social movement. The question for the food movement, however, is not how do we change everything, but how is the food system strategically positioned to influence systemic change? So what does he mean by this is that, if we are actually looking at changing the food system, that's a good starting point, but it means that we have to confront all of these other isms that come part and parcel with this also. So we need to change the capitalist system, but start addressing these institutional structural inequalities also, and not just look at everything as interpersonal relationships, but actually that we actually have social relationships that are based more on society's function, that are governed by rules, laws, and customs that need to be changed also. All right, and the last slide here, I provided some extra material. If you want to find out a little bit more about agroecology, you can click on this link. And I highly encourage you to watch this excerpt. I think it's a documentary, if I'm not mistaken, about living soil. So, if we're talking about replenishing nutrients and eliminating the metabolic rift, we actually have to look at how do we prioritize living soil rather than dead soil that's just filled with chemicals and fertilizers.